afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brad Thompson, and I am the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism and founder of the Lyceum Scholars Program. And I would like to welcome all of you to our first ever Parents Weekend social event. When I got here 14 years ago, and more particularly when I started the Lyceum program 5 years ago, I really never thought we would have a Parents Weekend, and I never thought we would have a Parents Weekend event that would be so well attended. So I want to thank all of you, the students, and more importantly, I'd like to thank all of the families, parents, grandparents, siblings who have joined us today. We started the Lyceum program, as I said, 5 years ago, and we did it in part because we had seen what was happening on college campuses all over the United States. And I think for the most part, most people understand that American higher education in lots of different ways is in a state of decline and fall. And so we created the Lyceum program as an antidote to what's happening on our college campuses. And in these 5 years, it has been a stunning success, much, much greater than I ever could have imagined. When we first launched our first ever marketing campaign 5 years ago for the Lyceum program, we were expecting 30 to 50 applications for a program that nobody in America knew anything about except me and my staff of 200 people at the Institute, and we had 192 applications that first year from high school students in 22 states. For this year's incoming freshman class, we had 652 applications from high school students in 44 states. We're taking phone calls and emails from high school students and their parents all over the United States about this program. We have families traveling from all over the Union to come to Clemson to learn more about the program. So it really has been an extraordinary success, I think, and speaking on behalf of the staff and faculty of the Clemson Institute, I think this is, without question, the most important academic project that we've ever undertaken, and it's been an absolute delight, and it's been an honor for us to be able to educate our children. So I want to begin really first by thanking all of the parents in this room. To thank you for raising and educating such thoughtful and decent young men and women. They've been a delight for us to be able to teach. We are going to spend their 4 years trying to give them the best education we can. I think you all know that we use a great books approach, studying the history of liberty, capitalism, the American founding, and the principles of moral character. And we view what we are doing in this program really just as an extension of what you, the parents, have done in educating your children. So we thank you for giving them to us for 4 years. And to the students, I would say, this is your time. This is your big adventure. This is the moment when you leave the four walls of your parents' home and you come and you spend 4 years here with us, reading old books. I like to say that I have the best job in the world. I get to spend my days reading old books with young people, and I get paid for it. What could be better than that? But I would also say to the students, you really ought to take this time, this opportunity, and give yourself the best education that you possibly can. Because in a few years, you're going to go out, and you're going to get real jobs, and life will be very different. So this is your time. This is your great adventure. But I would also say that all great adventures, all great journeys must, in the end, return home. And so to the students, I would say, when you have the opportunity, go home, talk to your parents, have a conversation with them about what you've been learning in this program. And to the parents, I would like to say, you are all members of the Lyceum program. And so we would love to see you actively engaged in promoting what we do here in the program. And I think the best way for you to do that is, in fact, to talk to your sons and daughters about what they're doing here. Have a family dinner and talk about Aristotle. What could be better than that? And I think that I think it's really important for our students in the Lyceum program to do that, to go home and to talk to their parents about what they've been doing in this program. Your parents dedicated 18 years of their lives to preparing you to come to Clemson and to be in this program. And I do think you have an obligation to be able to share with your parents what you've been able to do in this program. So, I'd now like to introduce Mr. Jacob Roach, who is in the Lyceum program. Jacob is from Powdersville, South Carolina. He is a double major in economics and marketing and a minor in political and legal theory. Jacob has been in the Fellows program since his freshman year, and he graduates this December and is interested in a career in construction law. So, Jacob, would you please now introduce our guest speaker?
Absolutely. So I've been with the Lyceum program for a pretty good while now. I've been enjoying my first semester here at Clemson. Applied out of high school and didn't make a scholar, but it was great to join in as a fellow after that. And so it's great to have the pleasure today to introduce the speaker. Dr. Bessett is the Director of Academic Programs at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is actually unanimously authorized by a congressional act in the year 1993, and his mission within it is to educate, is to lead its education and scholarly activities. The program itself, the whole goal was to, from that point forward, educate that generation and future generations about the ideology, the history and legacy of communism. So before joining the foundation, Dr. Bessett was an associate professor of government at Morehead State University. He specialized in political philosophy, national security, intelligence studies, and counterterrorism. He is the editor of 3 books and author of numerous articles, as well as book chapters. He is past president of the Kentucky Political Science Association, a Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute, and an academic fellow of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, as well as co-director of the Bluegrass State Intelligence Community Center for Academic Excellence. Dr. Bessett holds a bachelor's and master's from the University of Alberta, as well as a master's and PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University, and an executive certificate in counterterrorism studies from the International Institute of Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya, Israel. Let's all welcome Dr. Bessett today.
I think I'm mic'd here. Everyone can hear me? Wonderful. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Brad. Very appreciative, honored to be here. Grateful to Clemson University, to the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism and the Lyceum program. And you young people are like super impressive. I had no idea. Like, small number out of over 600 applicants. It's a real accomplishment, and your parents should be patting you on the back. Let's just move this. I've prepared my talk, because I'm trying to keep it to 20 minutes, as a recovering academic, as Jacob mentioned. If I were to speak extemporaneously, there'd be no time for questions. Dr. Thompson mentioned, what's a better job than getting to read old books with young people? And to that I would say, fighting commies every day, which is what I get to do. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but for right now, the title for the talk was, why not socialism? And I think, it should be clear that I would say definitely not, but I'll try to explain. So socialism is having an unprecedented moment in America. Opinion polls show its increasing popularity, especially among young people. Membership in the Democratic Socialists of America is continuing to surge. Mainstream publications, such as the Washington Post, are publishing more and more articles that argue that it's time to give socialism a try. The root cause of all of these, I think, is the same. All people in all times are concerned with flourishing to the greatest extent possible. And in economically darker times, the ever-optimistic views of socialists is attractive. Right, so much of the appeal of socialism lies in its hopeful character. Socialists of all types, speak in hopeful terms about a coming future, right? A future they are working to build, to make real. Sometimes this future is described as one in which the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. Oftentimes, what is envisioned is a world characterized by liberty, equality, and fraternity. These two visions essentially come together and are united by the belief that individuality, right, the individuality of each human being, can only be developed in a society embodying those values of liberty, equality, and solidarity. The appeal of individual development, I think, is self-evident. Right? If life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means anything, it means that the individual has a right to, it means an individual by right is free to live his or her life in the manner he or she thinks will most likely bring about his or her lasting contentment. This position is actually mirrored in the social contract and the right of revolution, whereby, as we know from the Declaration of Independence, quote, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." Right, so in stark contrast to the British political tradition, which was based on hereditary aristocracy, what would become America rejected that. They rejected the notion that the accident of birth ought to determine the opportunities that are open to individuals. In fact, I think it's safe to say that if one were free to choose the kind of society into which one would be born, no one would choose to live in a society where individual potential necessarily goes undeveloped simply because of the accident of one's birth. It very well may be the case that it has been the greater openness of opportunity in America that has historically meant that socialism had a hard time gaining traction. And a data point that I think points us towards that conclusion is that we've seen an increase in the popularity of socialism precisely as social mobility has decreased. And as older, tried and true pathways to advancement, such as going to college, no longer seem to lead where they used to. As my foundation's polls have shown, a majority of millennials actually believe that America's economic system works against them. Which might be unsurprising given the record levels of student debt, the high levels of unemployment that millennials are still facing, or underemployment, and the low quality of some of the jobs that they're able to get when they are able to find them, and of course the low light levels in their parents' basements. Now that last is meant as a joke and not the fate of anyone here, but the sad fact of diminished economic opportunity is actually no laughing matter, but rather a serious problem that has to be solved. Millennials understand this, being the ones experiencing it, and are listening to those who propose solutions. Right, so the current political economic system, it actually exists, and thus its flaws, its imperfections, its deficiencies, they're all manifest. While the American experiment in self-government has succeeded in producing more freedom and more prosperity for more people than any other in the history of the world, and that fact is undeniable. That is simply true. There's still an attitude, one not entirely unjustified, of what have you done for me lately? Right, so to give voice to the question that seems to be hanging in the air, right, given everything that is going wrong today, right, why not give socialism a try? Right, so in seeking to answer this question, I will focus on the promises of socialism, because it is these promises that are contrasted with the current state of affairs. Right? In other words, it's the idealized promises made by socialist revolutionaries that compete with our understanding and experience of the actual political economic system and its imperfections. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, one could be excused for enthusiastically endorsing the socialist project based simply on promise. We had yet to see a socialist government anywhere. All that lay before us at that point was the promise of a better future. But today, 100 years after socialism first came to power in Russia, we have the benefit of having seen socialism empowered in more than 40 countries. We do not have to, and we should not rest content comparing the promises of socialists to what we actually have. Right? The socialist experiment has been run, and the results are in. So what are they? How well has socialism been able to deliver on its promise of liberty, equality, and solidarity? So I'm going to deal with each one in turn. I'll offer some concluding remarks, and then we'll just move to questions. So the question of liberty. When we speak of liberty or freedom, we tend to think of corollaries like autonomy, self-ownership, self-determination, choosing. There are two kinds of liberty that are interconnected in our understanding: positive liberty, or the freedom to act on the basis of one's free will, and negative liberty, or the freedom from external checks on one's actions. This is typically understood as the capacity to be able to choose between the available options on the basis of whatever criteria one chooses for oneself, or being able to pursue happiness however one sees fit. We believe we have the right, for instance, to choose our education, our job, our place of residence, whether or not we're going to get married, whether or not we're going to have children. If so, how many children we'll have. Right? Even in areas where we recognize a role for expertise, such as medicine, we believe that we have the right to choose our doctors, whether or not we will be treated, and if we are to be treated, what those treatments will be. Right? So in short, we believe that we have a right to say yes or no, and that yes or no will be the end of it. Now, when we look at the history of socialist governments, including those that are in power today, we see the constant and continual violation both of positive liberty and negative liberty. To give a sampling of these, in every socialist state, access to certain educational opportunities is strictly and centrally regulated and requires loyal adherence to the party line. Children of dissidents from North Korea and from communist Albania report being denied access to education completely, simply because of the activities of their parents. China today distributes educational opportunities at its top schools, places like Clemson, right, on the basis of one's alignment with party orthodoxy. Likewise, they regulate opportunities to study abroad. With respect to freedom of movement, subjects of socialist governments are not free to travel domestically or internationally without governmental approval. One can think here of the refuseniks, a personal hero of mine being Natan Sharansky, who I have a picture with. Right? Soviet Jews who wanted to immigrate to Israel so that they could be free, who were denied exit visas and often imprisoned. Perhaps the most famous example, though, of the effort to control the movements of subjects and to prevent them from escaping to freedom in another country is the Berlin Wall, the 30th anniversary of the fall of which takes place this November, right? That wall was built not to keep the West Germans out, but to keep the East Germans in, right? So that they couldn't flee. To look at China, yet again, individuals are assigned to particular regions. The Hukou system registers where and with whom they live and prevents rural residents from moving to the cities where there are greater opportunities. North Korea has a similar system with about 55 different castes, and only those that are most loyal to the Kims get to live in Pyongyang. In China, again, one is not free to petition the government for redress of grievances. When one does, like the blind lawyer Chen Guangchen, one runs the risk of persecution, as he was. His autobiography, by the way, is phenomenal. I highly recommend. It's called The Barefoot Lawyer. In Romania, Albania, Soviet Union, China, North Korea, one either was not or is not free to worship as one pleases, but rather is subject to very stringent regulations. Some states even went so far as to prohibit the private possession of the Bible, like Albania. In China, one is not free to choose the size of one's size of one's family, and this lack of choice is enforced by the government with coercive abortions, of which there have been several million according to their own statistics, and the last number that the Chinese ministry gave for abortions total since 1979 was 347 million. Of course, in socialist countries, one is not free to choose one's political affiliation either. These are single-party dictatorships. There's only the Communist Party. And finally, looking at Venezuela, a case study in the gradual and inevitable slide from democratic socialism to socialist dictatorship, one finds the reintroduction of forced labor and the violent suppression of political dissent. So their record's not very good, right? Well, what about equality? Right? There are a number of ways in which we understand equality: equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, among others. But the most important, and the one that serves as the foundation for all the others, is the equality of natural rights. That is, the idea that by the simple fact that we are equal members of the human species, we each possess an equal set of rights, including the right of life, liberty, and to pursue happiness. This is the very origin of human rights, this idea. I mentioned before the denial of educational opportunities to the children and grandchildren of political dissidents. This practice is essentially a form of corruption of blood. The political sins of one generation are visited upon three. Essentially, this means that the accident of one's birth into a particular family determines one's life. This fact is also applicable to entire classes. Being born into the bourgeoisie literally would mark you for suppression, and maybe even death. One can simply think of what happened to the kulaks, the wealthy peasants of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Being born into the wrong ethnicity can do likewise, as it did for 7 to 10 million Ukrainians who were starved to death during the Holodomor, the man-made, engineered famine that lasted from 1932 to 1933, which Walter Duranty, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, won the Pulitzer Prize for covering, where he denied that it was happening. And they've still never returned that for the original fake news, right? That the genocide wasn't taking place. That the accident of one's birth into a particular family, ethnicity, or class legally determines the opportunities that are open or closed shows that socialism really is a form of feudalism. This conclusion is simply reinforced by the existence of elite classes. In the Soviet Union, these individuals were known as the nomenklatura, who enjoyed a significantly higher standard of living than the common masses of subjects. The nomenklatura possessed privileges in terms of both opportunity and material well-being. They had access to special stores in which special items could be acquired. They lived in special housing in the most desirable locations of the most desirable cities. Essentially, they lived what would be considered an upper-class lifestyle. And even above them Even above the nomenklatura sat the party leadership, especially those who belonged to the Politburo. In socialist countries, there is no equality before the law because there is no rule of law. There's only the rule of the party, or even at times the rule of the leader. In fact, one of the most effective forms of dissent under socialism is to attempt to make the government live according to the laws that it has passed and the treaties that it signed, to live up to what it says on paper. Historically, Charter 77, a movement led by Václav Havel in then communist Czechoslovakia, called on the government to abide by its guarantees that it had given in the Helsinki Accords, especially the third basket that they didn't take seriously that dealt with human rights. Charter 77 inspired a similar movement in China called Charter 08, which was until recently led by the Nobel Peace Prize recipient Liu Xiaobo. And I say until recently because sadly, Liu died as a result of untreated liver cancer while being held captive by the Chinese Communist government. He's the first Nobel Peace Prize winner to die in state confinement since 1938, when German pacifist Karl von Ossowski died after years in Nazi German concentration camps. So again, not a very good record. Well, what about solidarity? I mean, they talk about solidarity all the time. Right? They hold up their hand. Well, what do we mean by that first? Right, so solidarity and fraternity, that's that feeling that we get when we're in the company of our compatriots, which leads us to sacrifice on behalf of them. Think here of the fantastic HBO series Band of Brothers, highly recommend, which takes its name from maybe the most famous expression of this sentiment, Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech before the Battle of Agincourt, which ends, "And Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by, but for this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." And if any of you have had the privilege of serving this country in the military, you know firsthand about this. One can also see this feeling, though, in the notion of Christian charity, which hearkens to the brotherhood of all men. Right? Solidarity, fraternity, that's what binds us together. It's the bonds of kith and kin, friends and family. Now, under socialist governments, the party state seeks to replace all of these relations. These governments are totalitarian in the true sense of the term. As Mussolini actually put it, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Socialist governments seek the complete atomization of society, the dissolution and replacement of all voluntary associations and intermediary institutions of civil society with state equivalents. For example, almost immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet state created the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization, also known as the Young Pioneers, membership in which was near universal. And they did this to capture the hearts and minds of the Soviet youth. Another example is the fact that there were no private trade unions in the Soviet Union. Rather, all of them operated under the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions. Lots of unions in there. Right? More than 96% of all workers in 1984 belonged to one of the 30 unions that were in under that umbrella. And the exception, that just almost 4%, were the ones that worked on the collectivized farms. Right? Or consider the use of forced abortion that I mentioned in China. Right? So the most intimate and private aspects of their subjects' lives are subject to coercive state control. Now, to enforce this state of affairs, every single socialist government has deployed secret police and encouraged subjects to inform on each other. This includes having priests, where religious practice isn't just simply prohibited, inform on their congregants, Friends inform on each other. Husbands and wives inform on their spouses. Children are encouraged to inform on their parents. The purpose of replacing these formerly private relations is to enable a greater degree of social control. If there's nothing between the state and the individual, then the individual is utterly subject to the state and at its mercy. No one can come to help them. According to the Platform of European Memory and Conscience, there were thousands of secret police and unofficial full-time collaborators in the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries. I'll just give you one example. East Germany had 91,015 secret police. They had 189,000 full-time informant collaborators. And that's when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. This meant that almost 1.6% of the entire population was full-time invested in the surveillance of society. If one includes also those people who occasionally informed on their compatriots, that number exceeds 15% of the population. It makes East Germany the most surveilled country in known history. Now, the ubiquitous existence of secret police and informant networks in socialist countries belies socialism's call to solidarity and fraternity. Under socialist government, genuine friendship is actually subversive. So too are familial relations, especially those of affection. In fact, the subversive potential of even work relations in non-state-controlled trade unions is clearly evident from the example of Poland, where independent, self-governing labor union Solidarity, as it's known, was successful in forcing the communist government to hold semi-free elections in 1989. So rather than creating solidarity, socialism purposefully cultivates social suspicion, even among the elites themselves, who are subject to purges and competition within the party. And we see this today in China, which has leveraged the power of big data in the most diabolical way. The communist government fuses together information from one's credit report with one's online purchase history and one's social media actions and interactions to create a social credit score that quantifies the degree to which you are aligned with the party's orthodoxy. And they then use that score in order to determine what kinds of opportunities are open to you, such as what kind of school you get to go to, whether you can study or travel abroad, what kind of job you're able to hold. Right, so, in conclusion, socialist revolutionaries have claimed that overcoming the bourgeois system would usher in a new way of life wherein the free development of each was a condition of the free development of all. Life in this classless society would be marked by liberty, equality, and solidarity. The appeal of these universal and universally recognized ends both captured the imagination of those who believed that there must be a final political solution to all human ills and justified whatever actions were deemed necessary for bringing this situation into existence. And yet, in each and every instance over the past century, politically empowered socialism has produced a system of servitude, inequality, and suspicion, where the life of a dissident is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The socialist experiment has been run, and the results are in. It's a failure. In fact, we need only compare the lives of those who lived in West Germany to those who lived in the East, or those today who live in South Korea with those who live in the North, which is literally a kingdom of darkness. But growing up in an era of unprecedented freedom and prosperity, and living lives that are only possible under such conditions, many Americans simply take for granted the political and economic system bequeathed to them by the hard work of their ancestors. Most simply do not understand that prosperity depends upon freedom, that freedom is like water, utterly necessary to flourishing of any kind. To push this analogy just a little further, If freedom is like water, then we are like the fish swimming in it. And like fish, we pay no mind to the water, despite its being necessary for our very existence. What we do notice, however, is all the dirt, right? All that dirt that muddies the water. Freedom's messy. It's filled with prudence and foppery alike. When people have the freedom to choose, they do not always make what others consider to be the right choice. Oblivious to the importance of freedom, many are open to the proposals of those who claim easily to be able to get rid of the mud by further empowering the state. Considering only the end, they fail to recognize that the means proposed amounts to draining the lake. And when one doesn't recognize the importance of water, right, it's all the more difficult to be convinced of the necessity of cleaning it rather than discarding it. Thank you.